Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with John Duncan. Not just any John Duncan, John the Duncan. There's only one. John is a YouTuber and PhD researcher who writes a lot about neoliberalism and also makes a lot of videos about neoliberalism. So I thought he would be a perfect guest for a podcast on neoliberalism. So basically, we're going to be talking about the nebulous term of neoliberalism that many of you leftists thinks they know. It's the boogeyman of the left. But often when it comes down to the details, we fail to differentiate it from other forms of capitalism, such as libertarianism, Ordoliberalism, or sometimes even social democracy. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, all about it, its evolution, and more importantly, whether neoliberalism has ended. The big debate, a lot of people have claimed that COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent massive trillions of dollars of spending have somehow put an end to neoliberalism, but we will discuss whether that's actually the case. But before getting straight into it, John, would you like to introduce yourself, where people can find you and what you do?
Yeah, I mean, that was a pretty comprehensive summing up of my entire being. But just to stay in line with neoliberalism, we better shill ourselves as entrepreneurial individuals as we are. So you can find me at YouTube at John the Duncan, Twitter at John the Duncan, fucking Instagram John the Duncan. It's just my name. It's consistent branding. I am a brand, and that's why I'm so.
We're all brands. There's no individuals.
Neoliberalism.
Only brands.
Yeah,
in neoliberalism. Yeah, so that's actually, I knew who you were before, just because I think we're kind of in similar circles, making left type content. But like the video, I think I saw videos of yours before, but the one which made me want to invite you on the podcast was your one on neoliberalism. You talk about it many, you talk about a few, but the one that was like whether it ended, one that was where you talk about Ordoliberalism. I thought that one was really important because that one. There's many perspectives on neoliberalism. I thought that video, and just in terms of like content, actually captured it probably the best out of most of the videos I've seen, because a lot of people, especially in America, they will see Germany as like a social democracy, or France even still as a social democracy. They don't really understand that there's variants of neoliberalism, or that they'll still perceive it kind of like small government. What do you think people get wrong about neoliberalism, and how do you define it? Or how do you think it's best defined?
I think probably it's easiest to start like with what people tend to get wrong. So we're sort of understanding it. And the sort of main things people do tend to get wrong are like viewing it as small state governance. It's just like, the government stripping away, government stepping back and letting the free market reign. It's about making sure there's no state, withering the state away. But what we really see with neoliberalism, and this is consistent throughout the theory and its practice, it's not like a contradiction in its terms, is that the state is strong. It's established to support and uphold an idealized vision of the free market, not the free market itself, but an idealized sort of function of the free market to protect the market system. And it's also set up to fundamentally change individuals and our households as well, and reorient them along market ideals, making individuals entrepreneurial, like we were talking about there, making everyone an entrepreneur of the self, as the sort of Foucauldian term for it. And to sort of reorganize society around that. And those two things are connected, because you need a strong state to be able to change people's souls like that.
Speaking of Foucault, actually, didn't Foucault call neoliberalism super capitalism or something? I saw that in an article somewhere, or like, because it was very new. I mean, Foucault lived really to see neoliberalism fully develop, but I mean, that's an important point right there about the subjectivity, because it's not just, whereas I think classical liberalism, which we often associate with libertarianism, we call it that today, unfortunately, but they kind of assume like homo economicus, that humans are naturally like these rational beings, whereas neoliberalism is more, I think, aware that a lot of this is a construct, so the state just has to construct it, right? I think, you in your video you say like basically neoliberalism shapes free markets, so to speak. I mean, they're not free markets, but they shape the market, whereas classical liberalism assumes the market just can operate the way it is, and that things function as they are.
Yeah, there's like an ideal that's created. It's a utopian ideology that strives towards this particular ideal, at which point, the state doesn't need to exist because they've created the ideal that the free market is working. They've created the particular subjects that exist and can therefore keep the market going as it should be going. But to get to that utopia, they've got to ensure that it survives. They've got to ensure that the people are the right kind of people. And like when you think about like when neoliberalism started emerging in theory, it was in the wake of World War II and the dominance of actually existing socialism on the one hand, social democracy in sort of European states, and fascism in other European states. The people like Hayek were like, okay, so the reason it's clearly like there needs to be something to force the ideal market system into being, because look at the world around us. We're down the road to serfdom in his sort of idea. So they needed to reject these particular types of ideology. The fascism one is interesting enough because there is a crossover, I think, significant between neoliberalism and fascism. And you did have there was a president of the Montpellier Society in like 1956 or so, which is like the neoliberal think tank, big neoliberal body, who himself was not only a member of the Nazi Party, but a member of the SS until like 1935. So there's some personnel crossover as well.
I know that Hayek famously said, I would prefer a liberal dictator over a socialist democracy. And
you prefer a liberal dictator than a democracy that governed illiberally.
Oh yeah, basically. But we know what he kind of meant. Like economic democracy, where people can decide, how to redistribute profits or control over workplaces. That he doesn't want any of that, So you choose Pinochet over like Bernie Sanders, basically. or
Allende.
Or Allende, I mean, but better example right there. But also von Mises, who's often associated with the more libertarian end, sort of him and Hayek splitting. Hayek kind of saw more of a role for government than von Mises, and von Mises famously called Hayek and a bunch of other people in the Montpellier Society that they're all socialists, and he left the room. There was that famous fight. But what's weird about von Mises, who's like often, he's a token Austrian economics guy, right? He's often cited by the Bitcoin gold nerds. But he also supported the Austrian fascist dictatorship, which is,
I mean, it's really very weird, isn't it? How all these people are so close with fascist dictators, eh?
It's almost like fascism is more capitalist than it is socialist.
Almost as if that is the case, yeah.
No, but that's another. You segued into the other question I was going to ask is, when did neoliberalism begin? Because that's actually kind of a contestable topic. Even though most people think it's Reagan, Thatcher, some say it's earlier, like Callahan and Carter.
Yeah, I mean, like you could see elements of it. I don't think it's not particularly valuable to put like firm dates. You could see things sort of start to creep in with Carter and Callahan before Thatcher and Reagan really sort of superpowered it. But I think, with Thatcher and Reagan, it's useful because they did sort of, whether there are elements that are creeping in before, they really got stuff going, and it was really like a conscious effort with them rather than something that is related to trends and increasing dominance of particular minds and think tanks, which influenced earlier governance with Thatcher and with what's going on? Have I frozen?
No.
Okay,
I can hear you. Your camera froze, but I can hear you.
Okay. We'll leave it like that.
Sure.
I'll just turn it off. Yeah, so with Thatcher and Reagan, you basically had those people who had a very conscious effort to create the particular Hayekian model, and being influenced by these think tanks more directly and more sort of self-consciously. So I think it's probably useful enough to say that Reagan and Thatcher really kicked off the era.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they really put the final blow and the nail in the coffin when it comes to labor, because of obviously the famous air control strikes, the traffic control strikes that Reagan basically just fired all of them.
Yeah,
which is kind of unprecedented. Usually they at least have to negotiate, but they took like the super authoritarian approach, and I think that's important because neoliberalism isn't like free market, small government. It's actually bigger government, just like
directed differently.
Yeah, pretty much changing the priorities. I mean, David Harvey kind of says like neoliberalism is basically a redistribution of wealth from the poor to the rich, and indirectly somewhat that could be argued, because obviously the priorities of the state are going to the capitalist class and away from the working class. And of course there's all these efforts to build a larger reserve army of labor. Part of the monetarism under Milton Friedman type ideas, I mean, is to sort of make sure that there's always a small, like a sector of unemployed people, because this kind of gives less bargaining power to workers. And it's easier for capitalists to kind of dispose of people. So it's very not free market, even though the point is to create the marketization of everything. It is to privatize as much possible, but it's very much, I think even progressives don't get this. They'll use a straw man of say, oh, the free market capitalism doesn't work. But no, I think it's precisely, yes, free market capitalism doesn't work. And that's why neoliberalism is there to like force it upon everybody.
Yeah.
Both economically and socially.
Yeah, I think that's right. The way that it sort of exists, I mean, in terms of its authoritarianness as like a state, the first national police force was created under Thatcherism specifically to destroy the unions, to combat the labour strikes. And that was seen as an essential part of creating this new sort of free market system. State power was massively increased to uphold this ideal of the market. And it's an ideal of the market, not the market itself again. And it's and with things like the EU, you've got huge supra-state bodies doing huge amounts of work to support the ideal of the market in areas like pharmaceuticals or global warming as well, because it's the ideal of the market that's important to these people, not necessarily the market itself.
Right. And that's actually another interesting thing, is Europe is often contrasted with the United States, or even the other European countries with Britain, as if, there's social democracy on one hand and there is neoliberalism on the other, or crony capitalism, or whatever as people call it, which is just really wrong. The EU, I think you would agree, is a fundamentally neoliberal institution, very much created to allow for the free circulation of capital and to keep wages low, to more competition, lower prices, yada yada. And also the fact, I think austerity, like one of the most insidious aspects of the EU is how countries aren't given the autonomy of their own currency, so they basically can't create money like most autonomous countries can. And this pretty much enforces austerity, like because they have to rely on the European Central Bank for transfers. Those comes with strings attached, so they have to usually bring about austerity, like in the case of Greece famously, and more recently Spain. And that's important. And this is also this segue to something you mentioned in the video, which I thought is the number one detail most analysis leave out, and that is the variations of neoliberalism. You specifically mentioned ordoliberalism, What differentiates neoliberalism from ordoliberalism?
Well, I would say that ordoliberalism is a kind of historicized term, which doesn't really exist anymore. It's sort of been folded into neoliberalism, kind of self-consciously by the ordoliberals. But that was essentially like a German brand of what would become neoliberalism, which held all of the similar sort of ideals about upholding the market, upholding capitalism, forcing it into being. But unlike the sort of Austrian school, and people like Milton Friedman and some of those more libertarian-ish parts of neoliberalism, the ordoliberals held that the state should guide and uphold those markets more actively. So instead of just being like supporting it when they fail, or having police forces get rid of unions because unions are a market aberration, the state can actually guide investment and guide things in a sort of not planning per se, but almost planning, like a hint at planning. And as ordoliberal, like the big ordoliberal is Ropke, and he is again also a founding member of what would become neoliberalism, a founding member of the Montpellier Society. So all of this has sort of become folded into what neoliberalism is and the different variations and tensions within it, because it's not an entirely coherent ideology. It's not incoherent in the way some people say it is. Like, it's not incoherent in saying like, here's we say small state, but we have a state, sort of incoherent that lots of people point out. But it's got differentiations within it, with some people forcing more on the sort of using the state or the suprastate to uphold the market system. And things like the EU probably fall more on that ordoliberal side of it, where the suprastate organization is used to uphold the market or push the market further. If you are really boring, like I am, you can read EU industrial strategy documents and see this really clearly, just the way that the market is held up as the ideal, and the whole like body of the EU is used to support and make sure that the market can penetrate even further and deeper into people's lives.
Could also the foundation of ordoliberalism have a lot to do, or not necessarily the foundation, the implementation of ordoliberalism in West Germany have a lot to do with sort of its competition with East Germany, because it had to, on one hand, be this, when it was given so much money from the United States, it was also expected to kind of be like a very much a market economy. But at the same time, it had to provide a quality of life that was decent enough to make it seem superior to East Germany. So I think having affordable healthcare and free education like it did was also, it's a very calculated approach to have a market economy that still, isn't, for lack of a better term, total shit like the United States, where, there's healthcare is completely unaffordable, education's unaffordable. Yeah, inequality is vastly worse. I think could that be part of it as to why there's this approach? Because I think they also called it, at least one of the early CDU politicians of West Germany called it the social market economy, which is very different from social democracy, right? Like, like I think that's something that's conflated, is ordoliberalism, which is, can we call it friendly liberalism, friendly neoliberalism, or friendlier neoliberalism, perhaps?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I don't think it's friendly per se. I think it just redirects its nastiness in slightly different ways.
Maybe it's there's also the fact that I think German workers, or I would say a lot of European workers or people living in Europe, have a more socialist history. So there is, I think, a more worker activism, at least than the United States recently. So like that could be part of it, is just that they're more willing to give concessions to the working class because they're more afraid of the working class. Whereas certain countries will be more likely to cut a lot faster. Like France, for example, okay, like whenever Macron tries to cut pensions, they're like French will just bomb cars, bomb buildings, and then he has to stop it immediately. Whereas like in Canada, we've had Stephen Harper like completely eliminate social security. Like it's barely anything anymore, and people aren't even aware. Like nobody cares.
I mean, like it is true of France to an extent, but they are also deeply fucked from neoliberalism themselves.
For sure.
There's only an extent to which you could say that. I'm no expert in France, but there's a reason they call Macron. They compare him to Thatcher. Like he's done some shit, and it's not new shit. He's maintained the decades of shit that's been going on. I don't know about like ordoliberalism in terms of its relationship with workers or labor movements, because that I think that's one of the defining features of social democracy, is that sort of compromise between segments of labor and like capital, and that compromise is something that's not necessarily existent within ordoliberalism and unacceptable to neoliberalism full blown, because you cannot have a compromise there. That they have to be like crushed underfoot.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing I really wanted to get to, is the sort of differentiation between ordoliberalism and social democracy, because some people will say, why can't we be like Germany? I've heard people in political science classes in Canada say, we don't have to go full socialist. Can't we be like Germany that has some socialism? Unlike that the classic socialism's when the government does stuff.
Yeah.
They'll perceive social democracy with Germany now, and that's really just not the case. I would not say Angela Merkel is a social democrat. I think ordoliberalism is more appropriate, because it's basically neoliberalism, just more government guiding the markets, specifically, because I think part of it might have to do with more labor struggles, getting more concessions. I think a part of it also just have to do with Europe just being more unstable in history, so there's a greater suspicion to markets that might play a role as to why there's a heavier hand. But it's certainly not social democratic. Like I wouldn't say Germany is even though they have remnants of the social democratic order, they're not a social democracy proper. Like let's say Denmark, I would say, even though Denmark has also been eroded really heavily, Denmark is still like kind of a social democracy compared to Germany.
I'm not sure I don't think any real social democracy proper exists at this point in history. I think Sweden, Denmark still are that far gone.
Sweden, I would say, is neoliberal. Sweden has turned a lot more to neoliberalism than Denmark has. Like in Norway, I think most like oil is still nationalized, and they still have a lot of public ownership. Yeah. What I mean is, I don't call these countries socialist, like I'm not, obviously, but I mean, so they're social democracies in the sense that old school like social democrats might envision them. Like, for example, when I say a social democrat, I think like Bernie Sanders and Corbyn are kind of like proper social democrats in the sense that the ideology, right, of social democracy is kind of using the state to bring about prosperity for the working class. And the idea, you don't need to change the state per se. You just need to kind of change the leadership of the state. And there's like a class collaborationism in that, yes, the capitalist class will still exist. It's still capitalism, but we can get what the socialists want just with this system. Whereas ordoliberalism is like very different goals. The goals are completely different. The goal is directly to make the capitalist class stronger, but they believe, unlike maybe the harsher sides, the neoliberals, to kind of have more, I guess, the state guidance in the economy, and maybe less deregulation. For sure, deregulation would be a big difference between ordoliberalism and maybe like Reagan, Thatcher neoliberalism. I think that's a big characteristic, is they're less willing to completely deregulate the banks, for example.
I mean, I don't think ordoliberalism exists today in like as a particular like style of governance or organization. I think that's something that existed within a brief period and then became folded into different types of neoliberalism as they exist.
When I'm using neoliberalism, I am using it like as a variation of neoliberalism. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
But I mean in that, like, there are people who will compare Canada and the US and England and Australia, who've been a lot more neoliberalized compared to, let's say, France and Germany. Even though I would say they're all kind of neoliberal, but there's a visible difference, right? And that's why I'm using the term ordoliberalism.
Yeah. I think the visible difference, I think, is easier to point to the particular histories of places like the UK, of like the Anglo sphere compared to Europe. That like the Anglosphere is itself the exceptional part that has more similarities within it than there are similarities between different parts of Europe, probably. Just in terms of like political history and ideological coherence between those different segments of the world. Like there's obviously much closer collaboration between Thatcherism and Reaganism than there was between Angela Merkel and Sarkozy or whatever.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, and it's important to point out too, because I've heard a lot of people say, surprisingly, that kind of, I get their point is that they'll try to say Bernie Sanders really isn't radical. And I've heard Chomsky say Bernie Sanders could run on the ticket of the CDU. And I think that's total bullshit. I think that's completely wrong. Like, Bernie Sanders would not be able, his policies are a lot more comparatively radical than like Angela Merkel's program. I think he could,
sure.
he could maybe run on the Social Democrat Party.
It's a silly. I think it's an always silly thing that people do when they try to make these sort of international comparisons between different. You get it a lot of the time.
I know, but it's Chomsky, right? That's what's surprising. Like, I think it's.
I would be.
But I guess I think it's just being American. Americans are often.
Yeah, I mean, like kind of comparing one. Yeah, I mean, like, I just you got it a lot with when Corbyn was still around and people were talking about, like, they supported. You got like people, British liberals who were really anti-Corbyn, talk about how much they loved Bernie Sanders, and they'd be like, well, this is an absurd position to hold, and then they're like, well, Sanders would be considered right wing here because he's not even advocating for universal healthcare, and it's like, you cannot compare these two contexts in that way. It's a directional issue, not an absolute one. So,
I've heard it. Yeah, I don't know if you remember hearing AOC Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez say, when we say we want socialism, we mean like socialism like France and the UK.
Yeah.
I never cringed so hard. That was, oh my God, that was so annoying. But I think, it's an appeal to try to make the politics of social democrats in the United States seem less radical, but it's kind of a mistake to view Europe as like still being mostly social democratic, because it's really not the case at all. I mean, Germany doesn't have free healthcare. That's also worth saying. I would say Germany has maybe a worse system than the UK does. In the sense that the UK is like Canada. They have a public system, but it's just so thoroughly cut and elements of it privatized. Kind of like we're in Canada, where I live, is a very similar situation to the UK. It's like we have single payer. It's just very underfunded and due to austerity and whatnot. But in Germany, they actually have a two-tiered system where they have an underfunded public system that so no one will fucking die and pay or get like cancer and turn into Walter White. They won't have $40,000 in debt, but it's still like shittier. And you will get really good healthcare if you pay for the private option. So it's a thoroughly neoliberal ideology in place in Germany.
There's a real thing you've got to be careful with UK healthcare when you're talking about the privatizations, is the issue of underfunding and cuts in that sense. Because when you look at the raw numbers, like the raw elements of funding, it's been increased dramatically and always been increased. Like throughout the neoliberal era, it's been getting more and more and more funding. The issues are privatizations and not meeting the demands. Those things are the issues rather than strict cuts. Even in austerity, the NHS wasn't necessarily cut in the way that
in Canada it was directly cut. Like, for example, like Doug Ford, who's the premier of Ontario, where I live, and he basically cut the amount of hospital beds and funding to nurses, stuff like that. And that screwed like our ability to deal with COVID, because he did that like before COVID happened, and total mistake. But I think maybe if they're increasing funding while privatizing in the UK, could it be that the funding is just going to more like middlemen bureaucracies?
Oh, 100%. And it's one of the ways, and this is something that's relevant for discussions on Biden's infrastructure bill, is that one of the ways that funding is that neoliberal governments since Thatcher, they're going through this particularly true of Blairism, was they increased funding for social services and for health services in particular, but did it through things like public-private partnerships, through like quangos, quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations, and things like that, where they just funneled funding into private pockets, and that got maintained through things like COVID and the privatization of supply chains, the exporting of procurement to outside NHS services, and all bound up with corruption as well, going to like particular politicians' friends. And that sort of a neoliberalized way of funding services is something that is in like part of Biden's infrastructure bill as well. When people talk about the infrastructure bill being a signifier for the end of neoliberalism, then you look at the details of it, and there's mandates for states to push funding through public-private partnerships, which never really got a foothold in the US. So in a way that infrastructure bill is being used to backdoor some further neoliberal reforms into the structures of state-level finances and state-level infrastructure, which is depressing but interesting, I guess.
And it's also depressing to think that people would associate building roads in basic infrastructure policy with somehow not being neoliberal or being Keynesian or social democratic. And that's just anything a practical society does, first of all.
Well, I mean, even if it wasn't, yeah.
But I mean, I get what you're saying. Like, it's in a super bureaucratized way that he's doing this. And also, I mean, this sort of brings to another misconception, and you mentioned this in your video as well, is like the notion that spending money or printing more money is an end of neoliberalism is totally absurd. And I know a lot of people associate that spending money with Keynesianism and not spending money, austerity, with neoliberalism. And it's not that simple, because also the way they spend money is, number one, in a highly neoliberal way. It's benefiting corporations, the corporate bureaucracies, but it's also a lot of this money printing, so to speak, isn't actually money printing. It's privatized Keynesianism, as some people are calling it, or privatized stimulus. And one of the perfect example I can think of this is quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is actually, it's not really printing money, even though there's printing money involved. They print money basically just to buy securities, to inflate the assets, basically the reserves of banks. So like they have a lot of cash, they inflate the reserves of banks, private banks, and this brings down the interest rates. So banks can basically lend out money at zero interest rates. And this is supposed to stimulate the economy, but it's so absurd because it's essentially giving banks loads of free money. And it's saying you can lend this out if you want to stimulate the economy. And it's proven not to work, because banks will still, even though it's zero interest rates, still give loans to people who are likely to actually pay it back. And this usually hurts the working class, and they'll just end up loaning to people who are like stockbrokers, investment companies, hedge funds, who will just buy more stocks. So we see, or buy more real estate. Like we see these big companies like BlackRock buying up tons of real estate, inflating real estate prices, and then different hedge funds buying up lots of stocks while the quote real economy is hurting. And that's kind of shows you what quantitative easing does, privatized Keynesianism does. It just kind of, when it's private banks sort of doing the stimulus, it obviously benefits, mostly the property owning class, not even all the property owning class, like just the larger sector of, I would just say, the financial capital. because even like this, lack of a better term, petite bourgeoisie, or maybe even industrial capital, still suffers. It doesn't even work for that. And but that's the important thing. What I'm kind of just trying to get across is, just because we have an influx of money and stimulus, this is a heavily privatized way of doing it, and it's very neoliberal. It's by no means an end of neoliberalism.
What that sort of stuff also does, and you see that we've seen this sort of emerging again right now. We saw it in the wake of the big quantitative easing and big part nationalizations in the wake of 2008. Was it creates the spectre of debt, and the spectre of debt is very useful to neoliberalism in both public debt and state debt and private debt as well, in creating moral forces to produce things like austerity, or to force individuals into precariety, force them into particular subjectivities. And debt under neoliberalism has been a particularly effective tool for pursuing its ends. And we're seeing this in the UK right now with things like people invoking debt to, cut universal credit, to cut welfare payments in the middle of the pandemic as it's still going on, because, we can't afford it, and people are in debt, and people are becoming lazy because of being in debt, and the state can't afford it, and the state shouldn't be in debt. So we'll do the spending, but we've got this spectre of debt. And you hear it in even like the way progressive people will talk about spending during COVID. They'll be like, it's the future generations who will be paying this back. As if
I hate when they say that. That's my whole, well, that was my recent video, is debunking all that fucking nonsense about the deficit from an MMT perspective. Because I think, although a lot of you don't really need to be like no MMT to know that austerity discourse is horseshit.
Yeah.
But like, even the thing is that, like, I hate when progressives buy into that, or they'll say you have to raise taxes to not cut social programs, and that's just not true.
Yeah,
I mean, we can liquidate the rich, sure, but we don't need their money to pay for these.
Yeah, I mean, I don't tend to try and get caught up in particularities of monetary policy and stuff like that, because it's just not what necessarily interests me, and my brain doesn't work like that. But I think, like, for me, the way that debt is used as like a weapon is an interesting feature of neoliberalism, and something that we haven't escaped yet, despite the massive spending programs, which are, to be fair to the people, the crew who are like, neoliberalism is over. The spending programs are unprecedented, and like they're beyond anything we've seen before by huge amounts. But still, debt and its usefulness to the neoliberal state is still a spectre hanging over us, for sure.
Yeah, and so yeah, we have seen an unprecedented amount of government spending in the form of the stimulus checks, especially in kind of the attempt to build back the economy, which Biden's trying to do with, the build back better, which has so heavily been compromised. Supposed to be like 6 trillion. Now they was compromised to 3 trillion, then 1.7 trillion. Now they can't even get it passed because of one dinkwad politician. Total failure. But I would still, though, is, I think neoliberalism, we associate it right with not spending much, but it's not just now that they've spent tons of money. And also, obviously, most of it, this is heavily privatized Keynesianism. Like quantitative easing is basically mostly private banks doing all the inflating of money separately from the stimulus checks, which is directly this, again, government. But I think this is not the first time this has really happened. The idea that neoliberalism was about deficit reduction was kind of always a myth, right? Because that I'm not exactly sure about Thatcher, but Ronald Reagan ran the largest deficit increase in history since Roosevelt, because of all the tax cuts. So if he was really trying, it was never really their intention, right? To kind of cut government spending, or they cut government spending, but not to cut debt, so to speak. That was never their intention. You take even quotes from neoliberals or like Dick Cheney, who say Reagan proved the deficit didn't matter.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they kind of know, a lot of them know full well, But I think if we stop looking at it like it's the straw man of free market ideology that just is about cutting deficit, they don't really believe that. In practice, no. It's more like a technocratic. I mean, you know what I find interesting is how Milton Friedman said his ideal society was Hong Kong and Singapore. And that says a lot about its beliefs, because those are deeply like authoritarian neoliberal states.
I mean, yeah, like Milton Friedman was involved with Allende. He was a piece of shit.
Pinochet, you mean?
With Pinochet, yeah.
Yeah,
I guess he was involved in Allende in just a very final sense.
I mean, and this is funny because it completely contrasts with the rhetoric, right? Because neoliberalism was supposed to be the kind of opposite of Stalinism, or whatever the strawman of Stalinism, and it's the the idea of bringing down bureaucracy, right? That was the kind of thing I think a lot of people liked, but it's ironically is Mark Fisher calls it the system of neoliberalism brought us market Stalinism.
Yeah.
Or as David Graeber will write about, like neoliberalism increased bureaucracy. And you kind of alluded to that with the sort of Biden bill. Like it has all of these bureaucratic, a lot of money is just going to stupid bureaucracies. I mean, what really is the relationship between bureaucracy and neoliberalism? Because I find that fascinating and sort of almost like a mystery.
Well, the word I wouldn't use is, the word I'd use more is like technocracy rather than bureaucracy. And there are layers of bureaucracy and different elements of neoliberalism, but one of the main sort of important parts, one of the core parts of it, is to distance economic control from any sort of democratic control, and that sort of really authoritarian way. They don't want people to have any sort of control over the democracy. So one of the ways that they can do that is through exporting democratic processes or economic processes to technocratic bodies, which necessarily creates a load of bureaucracy. Like if you've got something like in the UK, the Office of Budget Responsibility, that's a group of technocrats who like just check budgets and make sure you're not spending too much and things like that.
Yeah, like it's a household or something.
Yeah. And that is a layer of bureaucracy, but the point isn't necessarily the bureaucracy in that case. The point is the technocracy to distance democratic control over economic means. Areas where I'd say bureaucracy are particularly important in neoliberalism are things in welfare, for creating difficulties and trying to access social rights and making them difficult and morally challenging to get into as well. In that case, I think the bureaucracy is very deliberate. From having worked in that system myself, that the bureaucracy there is very deliberate and very deliberately off-putting to stop people accessing these things. I think probably similarly within education as well, increasing bureaucracy to put people off accessing particular social rights.
And also the private sector too, right? There's all sort of layers of bureaucracy in the private sector, especially in the FIRE sectors, so to speak. They call it the FIRE sectors, basically like the finance sectors of insurance, banking. I forget what they all stand for, but you get the gist. Like these kind of all these sort of things that probably shouldn't be privatized, like life insurance and pharmacare, all sort of stuff. Or there's all kind of layers of bureaucracy in between. Barack Obama, interestingly, when he was asked about having a public option or a single payer healthcare, one of his reasons why not to do that, other than the fact that he got donations from the healthcare industry, what he said is that all the jobs that would be lost, and actually a lot of the jobs that would be lost aren't like the actual people we need in the healthcare industry. It's all of these middlemen who basically have to kind of scam people for paying more for certain things.
It's an interesting, as I'm riffing off some stuff, it's an interesting sort of dimension of the neoliberal sort of state or system, that it requires the maintenance of all this, like Graeber would put it, bullshit jobs, not like huge government spending to maintain these layers of bureaucracy, so that some people have jobs that are nonsense and don't contribute anything, but they require that relation of employment to maintain the market system. Otherwise, people will be like, Otherwise, there'd be a crisis in the system, like capitalist system, of all these unemployed folk. But also, like, people would begin to think, why am I spending my days moving things from one spreadsheet to another? Why do we have to do this for like fucking 9 hours a day, 5 days a week?
Don't even get me started. I've worked in industries like that. It's just okay. Get this: Canada's had such a neoliberal response to high unemployment, and it's because part of we have deindustrialization has affected Canada like much of the developed world, but also just the fact that Canada's jobs mostly lie in mining extraction, like mineral extraction and natural resource extraction. There's just not that. Canada is super prone to high unemployment. And what was the Trudeau government response to this was to create a layer of government jobs, like bureaucratic jobs, that a lot of them are agencies geared to just showing how well the government's doing.
Yeah.
Like PR agencies that show how well the government is doing. And there's other institutions, like sort of skills training institutions, that are basically geared at finding businesses to give money to in hopes that they will hire more students or more minorities, etc. It's so ridiculous. Instead of just having the government like employ people with a federal jobs guarantee, like like a social democracy would, or even a socialist country would. Instead of doing that, it's just, let's give money to private enterprises in the hopes that they hire this many people, even if they don't. And in that sense, it is a free market ideology, because it's still like the freedom, the capitalists still have the freedom. That's what makes it free market, but it's obviously not a real free market in the libertarian sense, because the government's there to make this ludicrous system happen.
Yeah,
because a real free market can't happen. It doesn't work.
I guess there's a kind of like bareness about neoliberalism that sort of is almost admirable. It's like accepting the idea that the free market is and has always been like a fiction, and just diving past that to be like, yes, but we'll keep pretending it's real. We'll keep upholding this ideal of it just to make sure that it keeps on trundling along and keeps on going.
You know what? I also think it's important to kind of discuss these things in detail, as opposed to just identifying neoliberalism with Thatcher and Reagan, because I notice a lot of this is really it's bad with a lot of I think I wouldn't just say Western countries, but Canada and America, but it's really bad with America. Is a lot of people, progressives even, will fail to really identify the lack of differences between the politicians they're offered. Like in the Democratic Party, the differences between Elizabeth Warren and the other Democrats was perceived to be a lot bigger than it really was. And often you would have people like the Young Turks compare Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders as if they were like the same, just Sanders was a little bit less compromising. That's how they were often portrayed, even in the not just the mainstream media, but like so-called progressive media. And I find that really interesting, because someone like Liz Warren is actually the example I would say is like a classic ordoliberal in the sense that she's like a neoliberal who wants more government. Like she wants to, regulate the banks, and she wants higher taxes to sort of slightly discipline the capitalist class, but to still like pursue capitalism. And that is her ideology, because she used to actually be a Reagan supporter, and then started shifting a little bit more to like what she calls a social market economy, the West German model. And she was heavily influenced by Friedrich Hayek early on in her education. Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, and then later Milton Friedman. She is like basically a neoliberal. People don't really know that often. And she was interviewed before. She said, do you believe in like Sanders? We need capitalism, a bit of capitalism and socialism. Like this is like normie progressive media. Like they don't know the differences. But they asked her that, and she said, no, I'm a capitalist. I like capitalism. I like my iPhone. I just believe that you need more regulation. And when Trump famously said in the inauguration or whatever, or not the inauguration, standing, whatever, some speech, he said, America will never be a socialist country. Pretty much everybody clapped, including her, except Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
And I mean, this suggests like something that the fact that a lot of progressives can't differentiate her from Sanders, and she's perceived as a social democrat, that I think exposes that a lot of the left doesn't understand neoliberalism, especially in America, because I see her as just as frankly that, a neoliberal. Same with someone like Andrew Yang, who supports universal basic income. I think people have been so thoroughly given like the shitty end of the neoliberal stick that any lesser shitty end of the neoliberal stick is perceived as a social democratic alternative when it's not.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two ends of what's going on in people's perceptions of neoliberalism and how they've changed, particularly since Trump and Brexit. Is on the one hand, you've got the sort of centrists who've reclaimed neoliberalism as a progressive ideology, because they've perceived Trump or the right wing as being anti-neoliberal, which isn't true at all. They've all been pretty aggressively neoliberal in how they've existed and continue to be. And then so they've sort of self-consciously reclaimed the idea that Obama and Biden, they're the neoliberals, and neoliberalism is therefore good. And that's sort of the split between the progressive and the, quote unquote progressive neoliberalism and the authoritarian neoliberalism, which isn't a firm split, but, just to illustrate the point. And then probably you've got some folks who are further left who are trying to so desperately to get any sort of concession after decades of stagnation and being punched in the face repeatedly for several years, and viewing any sort of movement to the left or anything more progressive, like someone like Elizabeth Warren, or even some folk on the left who look at Biden and say that he's not neoliberal because of his infrastructure plan, which we can all, looking at it like we already talked about, isn't true. So there's
building roads is the end of neoliberalism.
Yeah, like I said, it's all like filtered through public-private partnerships and all that. But like, if we accept neoliberalism is about trying to ensure that the market system can survive, obviously it needs an infrastructure. So building infrastructure has always been exempt. Like throughout the literature for decades, the infrastructure has been exempt from the idea that spending is necessarily anti-neoliberal. That's a tangent of people to get on my nerves on Twitter. But there is like an idea that this sort of slight progressive movement is necessarily anti-neoliberal, and I think that's dangerous for folks on the left to try and hold on to, because it stops them from having clear criticism of what's going on.
Yeah, and also you mentioned progressive neoliberalism. I think that's an important point because you also touched on that on your video, debunking the idea that neoliberalism was socially progressive and fiscally conservative. And that's sort of often how, a lot of these, like the political compass meme, they often put neoliberalism like socially it's left, but economically it's very right wing. Well, it's actually kind of right wing both.
Yeah.
And it's that's the thing. I think people have a very recent memory of neoliberalism, so they'll perceive the more recent Democrats, more recent Blairites, who will kind of recuperate a sort of progressive aesthetic in the sense that they'll have some tokenism, they'll have some black people in their cabinet, different some levels of minority representation. Like they'll recuperate like things that are basically already big movements. But and this is perceived that they are actually socially progressive. But not only is that not the case now, but it especially wasn't the case with neoliberalism being first implemented. It was actually very much a shift to the right. Socially as well, right? With people,
for sure.
With people like Reagan, kind of bringing religion back into the conversation, as well as trying to like you mentioned the idea that neoliberalism is very much based on this idea of Western values, kind of like white Western values, and tell us a bit about that, because I think that goes over people's heads sometimes.
Yeah, so I think it's worth going back again to Hayek's sort of work in The Road to Certainty. He talks about like the value of traditional morality, which he sees as the only non-coercive means of producing social cohesion, is to coerce people into holding traditional moral values, and those have been like the traditional structure of the family. So all very heteronormative and patriarchal. And also it's all very racialized because, as they talked about throughout the Road to Serfdom, the idea of the Anglo-Saxon man is the sort of ideal person culturally. You talk about that's one of the things that comes up a lot is, neoliberalism is pro-immigration, and that's never really been the case either. Like Hayek spoke about the need to block out non-Western countries to stop them infecting the good moral character of the Anglo-Saxon and things like that. And you see that expressed. I mean, with Thatcher, you had the introduction of things like Section 28, which was a homophobic piece of legislation which stopped teachers from talking about homosexuality in schools, and was only repealed in the UK in, I think, 2003. That was a Thatcher era socially regressive, majorly socially regressive policy, and that's consistent with the idea that gayness would interrupt the social cohesion of traditional morality. It would interrupt the heteronormativity of patriarchy and things like that. But even with things like the Blair government, that government was so anti-immigration, scarily anti-immigration, set up a lot of the things that are being pursued currently under the hard right Tory government, of like stopping people from having citizenship, or threatening to get rid of citizenship, or increasing police powers, or increasing border controls. Things like that were all sort of pushed further under New Labour. And then you sort of come in, tile that up with things like the welfare, the disciplinary welfare system, which seeks to reinstitute or put the role of social reproductive care work back on the shoulders of the women. Like the reason that's privatized, the reason that things like care work is cut, isn't necessarily to stop spending, but is to move the burden of socially reproductive work off of the state and back onto the women, and reconstitute that classic, that traditional morality, that traditional view that women should be responsible for care work in society. And it's all bound up with that traditional morality and Western white heteropatriarchy.
Oh, for sure. I mean, and this is like I think actually probably the biggest misconception when it comes to neoliberalism is many people on the left, on the right, and people who on the left who try to tail the right, will kind of say, yeah, neoliberalism is it's economically very right wing, socially, but socially progressive, quote unquote, and often they'll misconstrue things like globalization, free trade, and whatnot. These ideas as if it means that neoliberals are less racist and more pro-immigration, which isn't really true. You have really like contradictory policies. Reagan, on one hand, it's actually a very strange thing. So like there was tighter immigration controls, but an influx in illegal immigration in America, and that says a lot because there's, of course, a bigger social stigmatization of immigrants. Like they started calling them illegal aliens, right? Instead of just immigrants or migrants. And but at the same time, they're kind of like allowing illegal immigration, and part of the point of that is like, yeah, they want to exploit people and pay them less by not giving them the rights of citizens. So they want to like use immigration on the same hand for capital interests, but they also, there's still like the underlying white supremacy still there in the neoliberal order. And obviously just the fact that like one good example is I think the response to illegal immigration between the different candidates is you have on one hand the Trumpists, right, who are still neoliberal, but they'll appeal to this more overt bigotry, who will be against immigration. They want to build the wall, and Biden will take the language of a socially progressive, but keep the wall and keep the same, almost the same immigration policy. And then you have Bernie Sanders, who I actually thought had a pretty good, compared to the rest, immigration policy in that, well, like, why don't we just give the illegal immigrants rights? Let them become like, citizens. Which was, but and that kind of shows the difference between like authentic pro-immigration and the neoliberal isn't really pro-immigration at all. They just they want to reap the benefits that for capital that immigration has, because you need people to do the shitty work. So they want to bring people in, give them less rights, but at the same time they don't actually want and they'll also want to get in the votes, right? That's a big reason, I think. Not just Democrats will adopt some kind of level of tokenism, or what people call identity politics or whatever. But it's not just exclusive to the Democrats, but Bush also famously brought Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell on his cabinet. He was the most intersectional president, technically, right? But does that mean Bush was socially progressive? Not at all.
There's a really good article by Susan Ferguson and David McNally on which speaks to this. On this, I think it's called the social reproduction of precariety within immigration, or something like that. It's like the social reproduction of precariety within mass migration trends, which it talks about the specific context of lots of an increase in migration across the southern borders of the US in conjunction with NAFTA, because NAFTA destroyed Mexican domestic security, domestic. It displaced a lot of people because it destroyed jobs in Mexico, and a lot of those people moved forward to the US, and the US required those people to move in the southern border, while at the same time increasingly criminalizing them and increasingly placing them under sort of bordered necropolitical zones, making them really precarious in terms of their life, which meant they were super exploitable within these contexts, and that was incredibly gendered as well, because you get lots of. Not only are you more likely to get women crossing borders to then send money back home to families and reproduce families back in Mexico, but you also get an influx of racialized and gendered care work that's done via these illegal immigrants, and all of that increasingly racialized and reproduces both gender and racial norms within the neoliberal order as it is and as it stands, and is consistent throughout. That wasn't just Trumpism; that was throughout the entire history of neoliberal reforms, through international trade deals, through Clinton, Bush, Obama, and then to Trump as well. So there's a consistent ideological progress to all of these people.
Oh, definitely, for sure. I mean, and just also with the Clintons also kind of took on the image of being very pro-globalization, and but at the same time they were calling blacks subliminally super predators. Mm-hmm. So you can see the contradiction. I mean, with neoliberalism, I think if there is a distinction to be made between neoliberalism and neoconservatism, well, often people will point to foreign policy, but I find that one to be very dodgy, because in practice, they have the same in practice foreign policy. I'm very convinced that Al Gore would have went to the Iraq War, and obviously it fucking was Blair who sent British troops to the Iraq War. So I don't know how anyone could say it's neoconservatism is different than neoliberalism on the grounds of foreign policy. But if there is a difference, I would say it's in their masks that they wear. Neoliberalism will wear a more socially progressive mask when it suits them, mm-hmm. right? And at times, sometimes the opposite. I find it really interesting, the whole "don't kiss, no, don't tell" thing in the Clinton years is the perfect example of that, because on one hand they wanted to pay lip service to gay rights activism, but not go too far, and Clinton would still say, "I believe marriage is between a man and a woman," and whatnot. Yeah. So, but because I think in recent memory, especially because of Barack Obama, at least being sort of a symbol for social progressivism, people in their memories still associate neoliberalism as being it's socially woke, but it's economically terrible. And then you'll have, in response, I think, a lot of short-sighted leftists who will, I know you hate these type of leftists, and I do too, but the people who will try to reappropriate nationalism and patriotism. Yeah,
I wasn't sure which type of leftist you were going to say I hated, but they're bad as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, there of course, so there's the people who are who make the illusion of progressivism, the type of the Nike commercials, or progressive politicians who will say, or Kamala Harris. I think Kamala Harris is a perfect example, right? She's African American and is able to make herself seem very progressive, and she'll pay lip service to abolitionism, even though ironically she was locking up Black people for marijuana when she was a legislator. But so you have those people who make the image, and then you have the people who fall for the image. Most of them are on the right, who will say this new cultural Marxism is part of this whole cultural Marxist conspiracy of the long march to the institutions, and these people are trying to bring about a big agenda through progressivism and whatnot. And you'll have, unfortunately, instead of kind of calling this out for what it is, you'll have like some short-sighted people on the left who will try to, instead of like combating this illusion, they'll play into the illusion and then try to reappropriate patriotism to get the right wingers.
Yeah, I like to call those people dipshits.
You made a whole video about that as well.
I think, there's a sort of lesser brand of that as well, of the folk who are like the ones who've gotten so mad at like neoliberalized forms of quote identity politics that they've not understood the importance of race and gender, of ableism, which is consistently missed out in all the analysis. They remove those from any sort of talking about, like, any sort of discussion of left-wing politics. They, like, I don't like using the word class reductionism because it's not an accurate description of them, because they're not even talking about class. They're just
sometimes they don't. They're just like they're just like ranting about identity, not so much talking about class.
Yeah, and it's like one of the utilities of social reproduction theory is it shows how things like gender is produced through labor practices and through the reproductive labor practices assigned to particular gendered bodies and particular racialized bodies. And through that, you can see how gender is itself a class relation, not a separate thing from class, but class relation existing through particular, modalities of identity. I think some people like Stuart Hall would maybe talk about race being the modality through which class has lived. And that effectively showing how, any discussion which removes these ideas of gender and race from it is not even class reductionist. It's just not talking about class. You've reduced the idea of class to something that is functionally unworkable as an analytic, or even like even something that could inspire any sort of social movement. You're not talking about anything useful. And that is a similar sort of, I think, impulse which has driven people to talk about patriotism and progress and left-wing patriotism, because they're just talking shite. They're reproducing particular white supremacist notions of the world to try and push a really narrow idea of what class freedom means. And it's not that they're bad leftists; they're just not on the left anymore.
I think a good example of the way I like to describe that phenomenon is nationalism is a kind of a lot of the times a form of a spectacle, form of representation. In which people kind of act as spectators to this big other, and that is like this pseudo national identity, right? And there's a quote in Guy Debord, who Society of the Spectacle, where he says, if you try to combat the spectacle by speaking the language of the spectacle, you reinforce the spectacle, something along those lines. And I think that's sort of what's kind of going on with those people who are, I like to use the word tailist, who will try to tail the reactionary elements of what they think is the working class. And they'll know, often these people who say proletarian nationalism, they don't actually believe in nationalism. They just want to like get the right wingers on their side. And they think this is a strategy to do so. And what that just does is it kind of, instead of bringing them on their side, it's kind of, all it does is, at least what I think is, it just kind of reinforces all the problems of patriotism and this sort of
And I mean, like, obviously that's how it was always going to work. These people are like, you see it being played out and them getting increasingly reactionary and talk about masculinity and reproducing all that nonsense. It's like, I don't think they're that important. I think they're just kind of dipshits in my view.
Yeah, and it's I mean, I think some of these people have like a genuine attempt at wanting to get right-wingers on their side. They're just extremely short-sighted and end up doing more damage. But like Glenn Greenwald and people like that also do this type of thing. They know that there is like the left needs a strategy to reach out to like the Trump voters, but they do that by reinforcing some of the bad beliefs of the Trump voters, which is a total problem. And like, the poster child of on the, if you want to say on the left, I wouldn't say on the left, but he's perceived that way as Jimmy Dore is, he's perceived as, the type of guy who can reach out to right wingers. And that's true. He has a big reactionary audience. And he might say that as, oh, I'm bringing them to the left. But actually what that more does is you have more people on the right who will be like, Jimmy Dore is someone I can tolerate on the left. Right. But, so it's more like reinforcing their ideas. Oh, here is someone on the other side who agrees with me. Therefore, my ideas about X, Y, and Z must not be that crazy.
If you've got lots of reactionary followers, then maybe it's because you're a reactionary. I don't think there's that much more to it. I think these people are just deeply reactionary in many ways, and even if it's being cynically reactionary is still being reactionary.
And there also is reactionary things still on the left in general.
Oh yeah,
sort of I know I don't like to just go, we don't want to call people just like white supremacists or whatever, but there is like elements of white supremacy, right? In the way people like talk about things, the way people talk about race. And I think a fundamental problem with why this still is the case is that people can't differentiate intersectionality from like token identity politics. They'll perceive them as one and the same. They'll say, well, why even talk? For their first thing will say, oh yeah, this identity politics is shambolic. Correct. Yeah, right. Like with liberal, when people like liberal politicians do, it often is shambolic. But then they'll take the next step and say, why even talk about race? Because class is what we all have in common. And it's like, no, it just, they completely disregard the whole actual nuances and how these things interconnect. And that's, the difference between intersectionality. And I noticed this is like a big difference between like the more sophisticated communist theorists and like people who are kind of heavily westernized and get into this stuff and they want to appeal to a lot of people. So they'll, instead of combating identity politics by bringing real intersectionality or having like a serious discussion of class and its connection with race, they'll just reject race, And that's such a big problem.
I think one of the reasons why that is so easy for a lot of people is that they just are. Like, I don't think it's a mistake necessarily that they've made. I just think it's difficult to decode white supremacy or heteronormativity and patriarchy from your thinking, and it's easier to just reject issues of race and class which may be challenging to your own perspective or your own subjectivity than it is to integrate them with any sort of cohesive analysis. So they see the sort of liberal identity politics or whatever, and they see it as a good excuse to reject any form of racial analysis or any form of colonial analysis or gendered analysis from their thinking. Because it's just easier for them than to deal with being challenged. And I think a lot of that stuff, I am less patient with it than I used to be. I used to be more patient with people, be like, okay, let's talk about this. We can push you a bit further here. These days, I just tend to think it's a reflection of people's own latent reactionary tendencies. There's so much work out there rejecting those ideas that if you're not willing to look it up, what am I going to be able to do here? Like, I'm not going to be able to combat it for you.
Sometimes out of compassion, like I will engage with those people, but then there's the difference between the people who I think are just kind of like short-sighted and making the mistake, and then there's the people who are like kind of just brands like marketing tailists, like the Jimmy Dore types, who are I think are a lot more disingenuous. And then there's the people who just like don't know a lot of history, who don't know a lot of like those people can usually be like pushed in the right direction.
I get like if someone has just read my first communist book, or I'll gladly talk to them about it. If it's someone who's been around for a while, especially someone with a platform, and they're spewing out nonsense, it's just, well, I'm not. You're not part of my movement. You make people unsafe.
Yeah,
I'm not having you here.
Yeah, I'm gonna move to the next topic, but like one point on this I have to mention just because it's related, is like the idea of just embracing the American flag with the communists is it has so much problems, because by doing so you pretty much have to like reinforce historical revisionism and pretty much believe in the illusion of the founding fathers and forget about settler colonialism, forget about genocide, forget about slavery. You kind of have to do that if you're going to embrace the American flag, because it's almost like as if East Germany kept the Nazi flag.
It's not just forgetting about history; it's accepting the continued genocide of indigenous people on
that as well.
Abya Yala.
Yeah. Now we talked about whether like neoliberalism is kind of continuing, and I think it's sort of answered a question I was going to ask, but like, I mean, we kind of both, I think we have know the answer, but like, has neoliberalism ended, and could it end? If so, by its own contradictions or by its overthrow? Now, I have my belief on this. I'm very much not a determinist, so I don't think like capitalism just collapses and there's a revolution. Like we can't wait for collapses. I mean, capitalism already collapses all the time. And pretty much it'll take like the people to make history. But it's a debatable question, because, you know, there's some people like Yanis Varoufakis who have been making a very interesting argument that we're kind of approaching a neo-feudalism.
Yeah,
away from capitalism.
I don't believe that. I don't believe that Varoufakis' point about techno-feudalism. I don't think it's a particularly strong argument he makes. But no, I don't think. I mean, it's not over currently. Whether it is, there's so many, like, the idea of whether it is ending is a difficult one, because you say it for long enough and it will be true, because nothing's permanent. Hegemony constantly reinforces and reforms itself. So there will come a point, even if there's no substantive break, where you go, this hegemony has reformed itself beyond the recognition of what we would previously call neoliberalism. I don't think there's a break with it. I don't think it's dead in the sense that, like, its central motivating features are being moved away from. Like the subjectification processes are still very much ongoing. The indebtedness of the global south is still very much ongoing. Like the state is still upholding the market. You know, look at COP26. We had speaker after speaker talk about the solution to global warming being the market, being green capitalism, green markets. Like, I think the evidence that it's not over currently and won't be over anytime soon is quite significant. I think if it's gonna, the contradictions in the system, which might produce countervailing forces, things like, which we've seen, like the Black Lives Matter protests, which spread across the globe, were results of countervailing forces produced within the system, and not, which isn't to like denigrate any agency or say that people didn't have agency. The conditions which allowed people to push further and to use their agency were created by neoliberalism. And we saw, like, you know, the destruction of state caring facilities produced lots of opportunities for mutual aid and produced lots of opportunities for people to come together as communities, which is useful in producing social movement activism against neoliberalism. So there are plenty of opportunities developing and plenty of movements developing. Chile being a good example of movements developing in the wake of neoliberalism, students' movements, and combining with women's movements to sweep a social democrat to power within Chile is a good example there. I don't think the internal contradictions are going to kill it on its own. I think it will need social movement activism.
Well, yeah, for sure. I think, and we also seen a sort of a backlash against neoliberalism. Well, we saw it earlier, but again, like with the pink tide in Latin America, starting to see, obviously we have the Evo Morales' party getting back power after the coup. People are fighting back there. You have Lula potentially coming back on the scene, although I think Lula is the most lukewarm of the pink tide, but still good nonetheless, improvement. But you also Gabriel Boric in Chile, sort of kind of at least saying that they're going to end neoliberalism. And I think there is something very different. Like, even though these countries can't really, at least like Bolivia, Venezuela, can't really be described as socialist, but they kind of try to reject neoliberalism. I would say like they are kind of proper, at least Bolivia, definitely proper social democracy. All of them have their problems, of course, but it does represent sort of a prediction a lot had that a lot of the resistance to neoliberalism will actually first be in the global South, and I can see that.
Yeah,
I mean, it makes sense, but also I think part of why I don't like to rely on determinism, generally speaking, for like crisis, because neoliberalism is kind of like a perfected form of capitalism, at least perfected for the bourgeoisie, but in that the amount of state control allows the state to fix capitalism's messes so easily. Back in the day, in the 1800s, this is why it's so important. I remember I saw one comment on your video that said, "Isn't that just capitalism? Is neoliberalism just capitalism?" And I know that there's a tendency, if you read Marx, you'll see like capitalism was always fucked. But yeah, there is a qualitative difference between neoliberalism and earlier capitalism, like laissez-faire liberal, classical liberal capitalism. And back in the day, capitalism was way more chaotic. Like there was a lot more crises. And when there was a financial crisis, just whether it be in like real estate or the stock market or falling rates of profit, that could collapse the whole economy and lead to like massive poverty. That happened many times. I mean, there is I think Isaac Newton even lost a lot of money in one of the very early capitalist crises in England. Basically, back then there really was much more instability, and we're not going to see like a Great Depression again. That's my view. Like there is this prediction with some that it'll all build up to this Great Depression. I don't really think neoliberalism allows us to happen. We're not going to see a Great Depression. We're already just having like one drawn out depression for a very long time, because what neoliberalism is able to do is the state is able to immediately, as soon as anything, the stock market collapses, viruses, they're able to just come in there, flood the system with a lot of money, keep it going like a zombie.
I don't know. I don't want to make predictions. I'm always loath to make predictions because I don't want to be proven. I don't want myself being wrong on any sort of file anywhere. So I can, if it does happen, I can be. I always thought this was going to happen. Prove it.
For brevity's sake, got to end the podcast here. But John, it was fantastic having you on.
It was a pleasure to get on eventually.
yeah, for sure. I highly encourage the viewers to check out John's video on neoliberalism if you haven't already. And he also almost every other video of his talks on neoliberalism in some shape. So just check them all out.
Even when I'm talking about Chicken Run, I talk about neoliberalism. So
I haven't seen that one yet, but I saw that one's getting a lot of views.
It's absurd.
It's in my watch later. But yeah, peace out.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Cheers.
If you enjoy the podcast as well as the video documentaries that I do on the One Dime channel, then supporting me on Patreon will be one of the best ways to help keep this content going.
fascinated? Right there.